was a plucky upstart. Thank you. This meeting is being recorded. Israel was a plucky upstart nation, providing a safe haven for the Jews and was turning the desert green. From that distant perspective, what was not to love? Is it me again now? Yeah. Okay. I want to take you on my personal, subjective journey through Zionism, from that hopeful 5-year-old in the photo to where I am today, strangely, perhaps ever hopeful. I was 9 when the Six-Day War happened, but I was not yet big on Israel. My dad was elated that East Jerusalem had been liberated. As a civil servant working for the UK government in Lebanon and Syria in the mid-60s, he had always made contact with the local Jewish communities and found a minion and a welcome, and had actually crossed the border at the Mandelbaum Gate on a diplomatic passport into East Jerusalem to daven at the Wailing Wall amid the houses that abutted it. He was thrilled. I was pretty indifferent to his stories. It wasn't until my bar mitzvah year in 1970 that Israel came alive for me. The first thing that really thrilled me was the humid heat, like a wall, and the delicious Mediterranean scents that greeted me as we got off the plane on my special bar mitzvah trip with my parents in the pitch black of Lod Airport. This was not the Norfolk House Hotel in Westgate. We, Mum, Dad, and I stayed in Netanya and Jerusalem for the month of August. Next big thrills, all the restaurants were kosher, the ordinary ones, not just the special ones like Bloom's in Whitechapel or Golders Green. I burnt my fingers on the shishlik skewer as I discovered the delights of Middle Eastern cuisine for the first time. First falafel, first hummus, first Israeli pickles, totally unlike the Hamisher homemade wallies at Jack's, which his wife Bubbles, she had a tightly curled blue rinse, hence the name, served to you in a greaseproof paper for a halfpenny out of a barrel. Not sure if the spicy Israeli ones were actually better, but I digress. My first avatia, watermelon, and first garinim, which you crunched, spat out the shells, and then your sandals got stuck to the floor as you crunched around over them. I loved the atmosphere, the sizzling beaches, the sunglasses and the shouting. Tel Aviv bus station and the guilt-tripped from Germany Mercedes Cherut shared taxis. The smells and sounds of Israel got burnt in that summer and have stayed with me ever since. In Netanya, we stayed in Pension Piroshka on Usishkin Street, a few blocks back from the beach. It was presided over by a bustling Hungarian matron in a perpetual apron and white clogs with white ankle socks. She was called, unsurprisingly, simply Piroshka. My dad spoke to her in Yiddish, and it was mostly about breakfast. Was für ein Ei, Spiegelei, omelette, vermischt. It was the first time I'd seen numbers tattooed on an arm. There was her fading grey concentration camp number as she placed the plate of eggs in front of me. This trip grounded me in a warm sort of pride and affection for a place that belonged to me, but was so different and far away. The flights there and back were an amazing part of this new departure. In fact, our BOAC VC-10 home at the very end of August 1970 was precisely a week before the Palestinian group Black September hijacked and, having emptied it of passengers, blew up a similar aircraft. Suddenly, I was connecting with the politics. My conscious Zionism started at the Hanegev Cafe on Finchley Road, with a bunch of Jewish teenagers from my school and roundabout. I'd seen my big sister go to the Jewish clubs, but these were mostly social, spec and so on, with a bit of Habonim thrown in. At 14 and 15, I got to hear about a club called FZY, Federation of Zionist Youth, and my love affair with Israel blossomed. We were the Palmer's Green chapter, and met in people's houses every Sunday evening. I loved it and became the Tarbut officer in charge of organising cultural meetings, always to do with Israel. By the time I was 16, FZY Summer Tour was the big prize on the horizon. And this was where I consolidated the connection between falling in love with a girl from Finchley and making the desert bloom. It all came together on that tour under the stars in my sleeping bag in Eilat, but I won't mention Carol Mendoza's name in case she's out there listening. We went everywhere and we sang and we laughed and we shouted and cried. The kibbutzniks hated us because we were a bunch of spoilt North London brats, but we didn't notice from our bubble, a bubble in which the Palestinians were nothing more than the people you bargained with in the souk, just inside the Jaffa Gate. In a way, it was a step back from my first trip there with my parents in 1970. It was the transplant of youthful arrogance and joie de vivre onto a perfectly choreographed template, the Jewish Youth Tour, choreographed by the Jewish agency, one big youthful kumsitz of love and Jewish exclusivity. Tour was for me the summer before the 1973 Yom Kippur War, and the following year everything was different. I wanted to go back to Israel and think a bit more carefully about it all. Everyone was much less gung-ho about Zionism. We'd all been seriously rattled. Fast forward 20 years, by the way, and I had powerful conversations with my wife Gabby's cousin's husband, our beloved Oded, who was a tank commander in the Golan in that war, and who lost many friends for whom that war was an existential matter of life and death, both personally and nationally. But back in 1974, and off I go to Kibbutz Endor, at the foot of Mount Tabor in the Jezreel Valley in Galilee, with a bunch of guitar strumming friends from London. This time I felt some of the anxiety along with the fun. This sometimes came in the shape of Tzvi, a diminutive Marxist kibbutznik from Toronto, who was in charge of the apple orchard. "Don't bullshit me, boy," he yelled in my face when I complained that the work was too hard in this heat. We loved the relief of diving into the pool in the hot, dead, still afternoons, after the rigors of climbing ladders and filling canvas buckets tied round our necks with Jonathan apples from 5 a.m. to midday. I loved the breakfast at 7 as the sun was coming up at a long table in one of the green alleyways of apple trees. I hated the cloud of fine white dust that settled on the from UCLA on their junior year abroad from UCLA, Dartmouth, Indiana University, the University of North Carolina, and so on. I loved my roommates, Harvey Eunice, Alan B. Goldberg, Susie Leonard, and all the rest. Very few Israeli friends and very little Ivrit was spoken in Shikonei HaElef, or Shikonei HaKelef, as we hilariously called it. The dog kennels. Most courses were in English, but all were fascinating, including my all-time favorite, the Geography of Jerusalem, which involved a weekly walking class to cover buildings and archaeology of interest in the city. I wrote my final paper on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is an amazing mashup of styles, denominations, and arguments, going back to only a couple of centuries after the crucifixion. It was whilst walking with the professor in our small group in that class that I experienced my first Palestinian hostility. Suddenly we were being assailed by flying stones. Ouch.
Oh, hang on, James. I can't have a clue how it is. Well, it's so easy. Well, I tell you how you do it.
Somebody's got their microphone on.
No contact at all. Yeah.
It's Malcolm Overlord.
Malcolm, lovely to have you. Okay, ouch, that hurt. The police came in and swiftly hauled us all out of the danger zone. But it was a premonition of the intifadas to come many years later, Jerusalem slowly but surely was beginning to boil. At moments of tension, you could feel it on campus too. This is 1975, 76. I'll never forget seeing a student wheeling a bicycle chain over his head, looking for a Palestinian to lay into after some flare-up, the cause of which I no longer recall. I also remember meeting an obnoxious young Kahanist among the American student cohort. Opus, where I lived in the dorms, in Resnick, Block 10, apartment 250, was a gentle Palestinian named Gamal. He was from a village in the Galilee and the first in his large family to go to university. He was studying engineering. He also had a large photo of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock on his wall. We drank tea and smoked the odd joint and became really good friends. I never made it to his village where he had invited me. I wish I had. We did spend many a time happily walking down from Mount Scopus to the Damascus Gate, where we would drink tea and eat knafe. We walked down through Sheikh Jarrah, through a thriving, bustling Palestinian enclave, car workshops, chickens, cafes, and baker shops. By the time I got to Sussex University in 1976 to study social anthropology, much to the chagrin of my father, who had me down to study law, the politics of Palestine and anti-Zionism were beginning to take shape on campus, and I needed to think through my position. I did a certain amount of jumping on the bandwagon. It went with the punk attitude and the flirtation with revolutionary politics, which could sometimes become tortuously enmeshed in battles over nomenclature. At first, I was in the RCG, the Revolutionary Communist Group, until we split off and became the Revolutionary Communist Tendency. However, I wasn't completely joking. I had read a fair bit of Marx and was really taken by the similarities between the theory of ideology via base and superstructure, grippingly put forward by Louis Althusser, and the structural anthropology of Levi-Strauss. It all had, and very much still has, a powerful and influential meaning for me in how I think about the world. I was opening up a critical space, and Zionism became a challenge. I still loved Israel, but hated the occupation. There was always a tension between challenging the politics of Israel that I didn't agree with and the powerful love of the country that was fundamental to me. This inner tension is as strong as ever inside me. Many years, marriage, and Rivka, Sarah, and Ovid later, my journey through Zionism settled into a vaguely critical stasis. It wasn't until I met the Solutions Not Sides team, for example, and made a series of films working with young Palestinians and young Israelis that I realized I needed to get involved again. I've been to Israel many times since university over the years. My wife, Gabby's family are always welcoming, although I, perhaps too much for the sake of a quiet life, avoid discussing politics. And this is the heart of my problem. Middle-aged British Jews like me have become complacent. We've put up with years of quietly supporting Israel, expressing sometimes a timorous critique of Netanyahu's politics and the politics of occupation. But that allows the tough guys to stay tough on both sides and for the politics of relentless oppression of the Palestinians to rumble on. This politics treats them like second-class citizens within Israel and as non-existent without, dressed up as a status quo and a backdrop to a dynamic and ever-growing Israeli economy for the privileged and not so dynamic and ever-growing for the less well-off Israelis. On May 18th this year, my daughter Rivka, aged 29, was on Newsnight on BBC Two in a debate with the associate editor of The Times, Daniel Finkelstein, chaired by Emily Maitlis. She started, Rivka, by citing the photograph of her father, the one you saw earlier, age 5, proudly sporting his JNF badge. The gist of her argument was radical and referred to how young British Jews could not passively sit by and watch Israeli apartheid destroy the lives of Palestinians, and how Israel, as it is currently constituted, must be opposed. I'm probably getting that wrong, and you'll have to invite Rivka along to put her case to get the full picture. Daniel Finkelstein vehemently disagreed. His position was fundamentally tied to the Holocaust and the necessity of Israel, citing his grandmother's experience and her wearing of a yellow star, which must never be repeated. The debate was at the height of the recent war in Gaza, the occupied territories in Israel. Passions were high. Hold on, let's have a sec. I agree with Rivka, and less so with Daniel. I support the creation of the State of Israel because of the Holocaust, an eternally laser-sharp horror of stupendous proportions, which I will never, ever minimize, and which makes me want to weep inside every day. It was terrible, and I will always reserve a portion of hatred in my heart for the perpetrators and stand foursquare with the innocent victims of Nazism. The gays, queers, radicals, leftists, the old, the infirm, the gypsies and travellers, the Jews. All the best, most interesting people and all the worst, all the babies and children, the annoying mums and dads, the crooks and gunners, the opera singers and artists, Freud's sisters, Paula and Dolphy, who perished in Treblinka and Theresienstadt, the millions who died, because they are my people in my heart, every one of them. And I support the creation of Israel, which, yes, was the culmination of a colonial enterprise, which used its own cruelty and violence to achieve this necessary end. But you see, I'm not prepared to sit there and rest on that position. And that's why I want to listen to and learn from Rivka, who is powerfully and necessarily moving the argument forward, rather than sitting with all the other middle-aged and young and old middle-class Jews in Britain, like Daniel Finkelstein, who park the argument in a solid bastion of Holocaust defense. That stasis not only dishonors the dead by ossifying the arguments for change and perpetuating the cycle of conflict, and as such, it foments a whole new round of hatred, but it foments a whole new round of hatred. Daniel Finkelstein closes down critical space where Rivka opens it out. Lord Finkelstein takes me back on my critical Zionist journey to my own dearly departed dad, Marcus Brown, he who loved a good Muswell Hill Kiddush and would only accept whiskey refills from Ron, who would always patronize me with a, not Ron, my dad, wait till you're grown up, you'll know better argument. Well, Rivka is grown up, Lord Finkelstein, and I'm her old dad who is breaking the mold. I'm listening to her voice and the voices of those like her who are not closing her down with the patronizing voice of the know-it-all dad. What is Israel if not an ethno-state whose policies in the treatment of Palestinians on both sides of the Green Line are finally shaping up as apartheid? I agree with Rivka that Israel in its current political form must change. She's moving my journey through Zionism on. I don't have to agree with her every point to still feel that she's opening up a fruitful and dynamic path that gives Jews a better, sustainable chance of working with the Palestinians, relentlessly seeking engagement until it sticks, recreating a shared homeland in a shared space. Daniel Finkelstein states in his 28th May Jewish Chronicle riposte to Rivka's Newsnight challenges, categorically, with all the certainty of a Marcus Brown at a Kiddush after a few single malts, we all know that the protests about Israeli action aren't really protests about Israeli action. They are protests about Israeli existence. We must pull the argument back to that every time. And we must make sure that young people who are under tremendous peer pressure over Israel appreciate this is what the argument is about and understand the calamity which Jewish people face if we lose the argument over the right of the Jewish state to exist. In other words, don't think for yourselves, just accept what I say. He is effectively saying that Rivka, whom he patronizingly refers to as a considerably younger Jewish person, is an enemy and a threat as great as Hamas. Well, he admitted that he has been, over the years, learning the language and getting to know the people, writing, thinking, reflecting. The outcomes of such necessary immersion is authentic and worth listening to. You might think so, but I'm not naive. The sea of anti-Semitism which underpins the convoys of morons spewing rampantly vile sexism and racism against Jews along the Finchley and Golders Green roads is despicable. And in this, I am more disturbed, perhaps, than Rivka, and sense it as the sharp-ended expression of a deeper reservoir of hatred of Jews that has always been ready to surface since Clifford of York. When it comes to the century of Israel's formation, the hatred was at times, and still can be, virulent on both sides, as forensically detailed in Ian Black's superb and essential history, Enemies and Neighbours, Arabs and Jews in Palestine and Israel. Hatred is not only about proportionality and how many more weapons each side can muster, it is also about how deeply provocative hatred can be. Hatred born out of a lack of understanding that is akin to blindness, as expressed by left-wing Israeli academic Baruch Kimmeling in his book Politicide, which is quoted by Black, and I have read that book actually. Kimmeling says, this lack of understanding has blinded most of the Israeli population to the poverty, the lifelong harassment and humiliation, the hopelessness, the perpetual violence and killing that blight so many Palestinian lives and lead so many young Palestinians to such desperate acts, acts that are not dissimilar to the kind the Bible ascribes to Samson after he was captured by the Philistines. The same lack of empathy has also blinded Palestinians to Jewish grief and anger when suicide bombers massacre innocent civilians, emotions that are intensified when many Palestinians publicly express their happiness after every successful operation. Ian Black also quotes Raja Shehada, a lawyer and writer from Ramallah, whom he says puts it more emotionally, and I'll give you some of Raja's words. Everything, and this is from more against Israel, everything has been designed by Israel to make Palestinians feel like strangers in their own country. By barbed wire that one sees whose ways are. We must remember Torah, whose ways are of pleasantness and peace, upon which our dream of Israel is founded. And we must integrate this with that, the necessary politics that says all people who have a claim to this land can live together in it. A new idea rather than sitting on the old obdurate one that has continued the spurious and redundant occupation for 55 years. Rethink Zionism. Palestine has an equal right and an equal place, and it will reinforce our own aspirations, and it will drown out the killers of Hamas and the cynics of the Israeli right who lay claim to a colonialist Eretz Yisrael. Enough of the killing and the colonialism. It's time to sort this out properly. We must take on the ugliness of how organizations such as B'Tselem now describe Israel's politics towards the Palestinians. Adam Schatz writes in the London Review of Books on June the 3rd this year of the recent war, using words that are hard to hear, but which nonetheless resonate with me. I'll give you a couple of examples. This war was more of a gift to Hamas than Netanyahu bargained for, however. He failed to consider that Hamas stood to benefit, not least because of its declining reputation in Gaza and the political confinement imposed by the blockade, now into its 14th year. Hamas knew that the Palestinian Authority, weakened and humiliated by Israel, could do nothing about the expulsions in Sheikh Jarrah or the attack on Al-Aqsa. Always more skilled at mobilizing than building, Hamas not only exploited the leadership vacuum, it neutralized the blockade by demonstrating it would not and didn't have to stand by while Palestinians suffered aggression in Jerusalem. The result has been symbolically to unify Palestinians from the river to the sea, as the chant goes, and across the vast Palestinian diaspora. For the first time in Israel's history, its security forces found themselves simultaneously engaged in the Gaza Strip, in East Jerusalem, in the occupied West Bank, and, most troubling of all for Netanyahu, in Israel's so-called mixed cities, where well-organized Jewish militias attacked Palestinians, who in turn attacked Jews and set fire to synagogues. The attacks by Jewish mobs inside Israel, often with the police standing by, has caused painful memories among Palestinian citizens of the killing of 13 protesters in October 2000, and intensified already acute feelings of disenfranchisement between Israel and Hamas is powerless to address, any more than it can address the root causes of the war. What Israel euphemistically call the conflict can't be limited to Gaza or the West Bank, because the same regime exists in different forms throughout Mandate Palestine. And international consensus on this is growing. The Israeli human rights organizations B'Tselem and Yesh Din, as well as Human Rights Watch, accuse the Israeli regime of carrying out apartheid policies. I'll leave that article there. There's more, of course. But this is where my departure from Zionism, its current expression, finally came about. I think that the attempted eviction of Palestinian families from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem was a provocation. Put away your legal documents, your title deeds, O Jews. This is where your neighbors live and flourish, your Arab neighbors who will live with you in peace and prosperity if you give them half a chance. The Palestinian people are our people and we theirs. We can and must live together. Yes, I'm a meatball-eating Jew from Palmer's Green, but everyone is connected. I'm a Jew, a Semite, a Red Sea pedestrian. I was there. I'm not mad. This is a serious part of my faith and love of Judaism and Yiddishkeit. What does it mean for me to be anti-Zionist or against Israel? Is your understanding of those terms right and mine wrong? Can they be fluid? We are not in the playground, and this is not a telltale game of who did what to whom. My Zionism and love for Israel now is to think, to open up a critical space, which I feel commentators like Daniel Finkelstein, with their eyes assured of certain certainties, as T.S. Eliot would have it, about how we need to protect ourselves from our enemies by always looking at the symptoms and not the causes. We all have hatred in us, and we all need dignity in our lives. My way of defending Israel is to find a way of changing on both sides the hopeless feeling of need when all else has failed, to allow the obscene and murderous nihilism of Islamic fundamentalism represented by Hamas, who cynically exploits the impoverished and fed up public in Gaza to pit itself against the obscene and murderous nihilism of the hijackers of Zionism. And I include Netanyahu here, who will only ever see it as a continuous silencing of the enemy, while the occupation and degradation of the Palestinian people on both sides of the Green Line continues. In Netanyahu's hands, Zionism became a corrupted tool of his colonial plan, and deluded itself that in striking back and settling, colonizing, in a strengthening self-defense, which in fact, by believing this lie, he caused Israel to eat itself. Louis Fishman, an associate professor at Brooklyn College, wrote in Haaretz that Netanyahu's greatest magic trick had been to blind Israeli Jews to their state's oppression of the Palestinians. But even the most carefully constructed house of cards, he says, eventually starts tumbling down. And that exactly is what is happening now. Impregnable Netanyahuism, the work of a master illusionist, is shattering. Let's just return to Hamas for a second. Let's hear from a Palestinian, Basma Galayini, writing in the New York Times on May the 26th this year, trying to unpick the arguments of the illusionists, putting the view why Hamas is irrelevant, actually. And I'll give you a couple of bits from that article. He starts by saying, when I was 9 years old, I was shot by the Israel Defense Forces. Most people I grew up with in Gaza have a story like this: a near miss, a face-to-face confrontation with a fatal bombing, a massacre. Mine is nothing special. It was 1992 during the first Intifada, and I was coming home from the afternoon shift at an overcrowded school for refugees. In those days, there were regular scenes of defiance and confrontation outside the school entrance between the Israeli militarized vehicles doing their rounds and the kids from the secondary school nearby. To my 9-year-old self, the clashes were a huge inconvenience. That's just a bit of his historical context. But now it's 2021 rather, and he's been living in Britain for 12 years. I've been living in Britain for 12 years, happily married with 2 young children. I was and am a lucky one, luckier than lucky, waking each morning for the most of the last 2 weeks to scroll through the latest pictures of the dead and swipe through pictures of my old neighborhood, school, university buildings, and places of my childhood destroyed. I ask myself, what's so hard for people to understand? Home is a universal concept, isn't it? You only have one home and it's precious. So why are some people still rotely saying that the situation in Gaza is complicated, or it's about religion? For many of us, it's neither of these things. And it's not about Hamas either. President Biden's announcement about the ceasefire on Friday emphasized the diplomatic efforts conducted with Israel, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Egypt as mediator. He said that Gaza would be rebuilt with international help and that we will do this in full partnership with the Palestinian Authority, not Hamas, the authority, in a manner that does not permit Hamas to restock its arsenal. But by pointedly excluding Hamas, the Biden administration only perpetuates the myth that Hamas is the central problem. I'll just move on to the end. And that is perfect for the Israelis, he says. Hamas, with its iron grip and rocket attacks, is the ideal hook on which to hang all the blame. Its popularity has declined since 2006, though that has been buoyed lately, but that too actually is irrelevant. What Palestinians think of Hamas has nothing to do with what they think of the right to a legitimate resistance, and most of us believe in the latter. Who wouldn't in our position? So he's just saying that they have nothing else, to go for them. And now, if the ceasefire does hold, the spectacular violence of the last 2 weeks will slip out of the news cycle as Palestinians go back to suffering, largely out of view, the slow motion violence of Israel's continued oppression in its blockade of Gaza, its militarization of the West Bank, more evictions of Palestinians. I'll leave him there for the moment. Is this business as usual? I'm getting to the end, by the way. Hamas are provokers. Israel, represented by the IDF, is provoked. Bloodshed ensues. There is fear, intimidation, and a continuing downward spiral. The murderous planners of Hamas are cynical. They know their actions will cause civilian deaths amongst their own people, but they send the incendiary bombs up anyway, because they know that these appear to be mere pinpricks to the distant Guardian readers like me, who will only see the headline of disproportionate Israeli aggression posing as necessary retaliation against innocent civilians, and so it goes on. In a way, Zionism is mutually hijacked by the provokers and the provoked. Neither really wants to serve the cause of justice and peace, as really evoked by the idea of Zion, as beautifully expressed in the Singer's Prayer Book of the 60s. And when I read these words, which I'm going to give you in a sec, I hear them spoken in Reverend Domowitz's deeply guttural, yet rich, Polishly, Yiddishly inflected tones. Heavenly Father, grant peace in thy holy land, and everlasting happiness unto all its inhabitants, so that Jacob shall again be in quietude and at ease, and none shall make him afraid. Do thou spread the tabernacle of thy peace upon all the dwellers on earth. May this be thy will, and let us say, Amen. If we are here put on earth to do God's will, Indeed, if that is the whole purpose of creation, which at a profound and immediate level, I believe, then it's up to us to do the politics that will make it happen. Are the Jewish people creating an outpost called Eviatar next door to the Palestinian town of Nablus, as was in a recent Guardian article, really spreading the tabernacle of peace and masking the glory of his kingdom manifest in the land which he sware unto our fathers to give us? Well, if you take the words literally, if Zionism means take for yourself and ignore the needs, the sensitivities, the dignity of those who watch you encroaching on their space from the next hill, then sure, you're doing God's will, as I'm sure those settlers believe. But my Zionism is predicated on the unchanging law of Torah, which could be said to start with Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 18, which concludes, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, I am the Lord." Constantly creating new and bigger villages in your neighbor's backyard and by evicting them from their homes where they've dwelt for many decades, even if by default, is a provocation encouraged by a provoking and provoked system of regimes with hatred and mistrust at its heart. I'm talking here about the entrenched Israeli governments of recent years and the haters of Hamas here. It's not generating a Zionism that I wish to cling to. It's the Zionism of the bully. Yes, I know we're on a tough street in the Middle East, but this only makes it tougher. My Zionism is about a return to the values of Torah, from which I profoundly believe it has currently strayed, defected. From where I sit, Zionism isn't worth it unless we act on behalf of all the dwellers of the land. With all the dwellers of the land. We have sat there over the years in our pews, in our complacency, listening to the prayer for the welfare of the state of Israel. This is the bit of the service that's rattled off and few people take to heart and think about and reflect upon. It just forms a polite, familiar, innocuous bridge between the Kriyat Torah and Musaf on Shabbos morning in Shul. Yet these words should be burned in our souls as the blueprint for action. It's up to us to implement true Zionism of peace and genuine mutual respect with all the difficulties and compromises that will entail, to do it with ruthless determination to achieve justice with peace, to draw our enemies back round the table rather than keep up the attrition. That's the Zionism I would embrace, and that's the enactment of the clear commands of my faith. The prayer for Israel's welfare acknowledges our frailty and asks God to strengthen our leaders' resolve to achieve peace. And incidentally, I'm not with David Baddiel on this one. Israel does matter to me. What happens there does affect me. And this is a part of my identity. I, as a London-born Jew, am deeply, inherently, symbiotically attached, connected, and in awe of the land of Israel we have created. Nor am I with Rosa Doherty, whose byline in the JC on the 21st of May, saying Jewish progressives don't stand up against anti-Semitism here in the UK, such as the vile convoys during the recent conflict, using the excuse that it arises out of far worse racism in Israel and is therefore understandable, is not justified. She says, I have no idea how progressive movements have become so lacking in a basic sense of what is right and wrong that they feel the need to practice a performative like me because a government 3,000 miles away is doing something they do not like. I'm a progressive and I'm not saying that. I don't make these sweeping generalizations, which are the enemy of thinking. I haven't heard any progressives making these excuses. Rosa is bolstering a nasty fantasy that takes root amongst those of us who are terrified of thinking. We Jews here, Jews in Israel, Jews everywhere have a responsibility to take on and oppose political wrongdoing and the resulting systematic cruelty and oppression of the Palestinians by Israel without ignoring the evil done on the other side. Has Rosa not heard of the brilliant and ever-growing Na'amod, British Jews against the occupation? The brilliant and ever-growing Yachad. These movements can and do differentiate and make powerful arguments and take action against racism here and anti-Jewish, anti-Palestinian racism there. These differences are constantly made by them. But the bottom line is that racism must be smashed wherever it rears its ugly head and in whatever context. We have every right and indeed a duty as proud members of a British Jewish, progressive, let's call it radical tradition, to call out and oppose the actions of an Israeli government with whom we feel a connection for a myriad of reasons. Let's return to the prayer for the state of Israel's inspiring and clear poetry. We beseech thee, O Lord, bestow thy loving kindness upon its rulers and counsellors, that they may uphold it with judgment and with righteousness from henceforth, even forever. Put in their hearts the love and fear of thee, sincerity. May the words of thy servants, the prophets, be fulfilled in our days. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Our purpose must coincide with God's admonishment to exercise judgment and righteousness. It is time to forego our selfish drives in the name of a chauvinistic, one-sided Zionism, and to include our neighbours. So much of Netanyahu's project polarized and destroyed the aim of inclusivity, which will underpin the true path of Israel's guaranteed survival. How Israel needs to be constituted, how that must develop, grow, and take new shape to include the notion of equality for all its inhabitants on both sides of the many dividing lines, both physical and emotional, I'll leave for another day. It's the principles of Zionism that need, in my opinion, reclaiming and rebooting in the name of justice for all in Israel and Palestine. It's urgent. We need to listen to our younger, radical, challenging Jewish voices. We need to listen to and think with young Palestinian and Israeli voices for peace and work with them to achieve peace. So finally, how do we open up a critical space and not close it down? That's a question I'll leave open. The end.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Wonderful talk, and thank you for bringing me back to my kibbutz days, 5 o'clock in the morning. I remember that very well. So I'm opening up the floor for whoever would like to ask Stephen a question.
The new government will prepare?
What?
There was one there from Lydia, but maybe we'll take a few first.
Judith's got her hand up.
Go on, Judith.
Thank you. Well, you got me pretty upset there, I have to say. So my first question to you is, prior to 1967, is it not correct that Israel was not trying to expand its borders, but fundamentally to just strengthen the starting of a state? And ever since its foundation, from the second day onwards, it's been surrounded by enemies wanting to eliminate it. So it's hardly surprising that this self-protective defensive thing, and then you've got 67, you've got 73. How it's horrible what's happened, I totally agree, but it's called survival. And a Palestinian can live inside Israel and their life's not in danger on a daily basis. Do Israelis go into Arab lands and expect to survive? No.
I think we choose our starting dates rather arbitrarily, and I think that actually from in the middle of the 18th century, in 1848, Italy tried to get unification. There were lots of national movements across Europe, and Zionism was born out of this. And in a sense, it started the colonial enterprise right there in the 19th century. And it was successful, and many Arabs and Palestinians sold Jews land in Palestine, and things slowly but surely got going. There's cruelty and there was destruction on both sides. There was virulent anti-Semitism. I agree with you. I don't think 1967 is necessarily a starting point. I think that hostility was all around, and that was one of the reasons why Zionism started in the 19th century.
Even I only bring up 67. And correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of the argument is all about the Jews shouldn't be in the settlements. That's what they say now. But before there were any settlements, before 67, there was still trouble.
Yeah, because I think the whole thing is kind of a bit of a misnomer between settlements and Israel itself in a way. I think Israel itself is a settlement that we should think about and consider. Not that come on, Rivka, have a go, because I haven't got. What should I? Take you're muted.
No,
Rivka.
I was waiting for the chair to. Am I allowed to?
Oh, sorry, no. Rivka's better at these things than I am.
You're desperate.
Beth, can Rivka?
Yeah, cool.
No, I'm happy to wait. I'm happy to wait.
I think it's Julie from you finished.
Well, let me take. I finished. Actually, Lydia's question about do I think the new government will fare any better? I do, actually. That's my strange optimism, and I'm prepared for people to shoot me down in flames. And I know we're already sort of I can't help saying we. The Israelis are already sort of retaliating to the balloon bombs that are being floated over Israel. But I think that the fact that a Palestinian grouping has actually joined in the government is quite interesting. I think that Lapid is quite an interesting character, that he's put the right-wing bastard up there at front for the beginning to be the, sorry, did I swear then? The right-winger to be up front there, Naftali Bennett, for the first couple of years. I think that's quite interesting. So give him a go. Let's get it out of the system. But I think they've stopped the Haredim from being involved in government, which is excellent. So I think there are a few sort of interesting little processes there. What do you think, Lydia? Come on, give me your. Come off. Get the mute off there. You're on mute, Lydia. Mute.
I know. Trying to think about what I want to say. Yes, in many ways, I do hope that they do fare better and that things do improve. I agree with you that the attacks, I suppose, on Palestinians and evictions from their homes in the East Jerusalem was really an act of provocation. I do agree with you on that, and I'm hoping that a new set of faces without Haredim and even with a very right-wing shell, shall we say, to get through first, will actually push things in a good direction in Israel, because I think that there's lots of very entrenched views, and I suppose I also come from quite a Zionist background, and we shall see. I would like it to be better, but that's me. Okay.
Thank you.
But I'd like to also hear from Rivka if she's going to speak.
Hello, everyone. Oh no, I can lower my hand now. Hi. Some people I recognize and some people I don't, and it's great to be here. Yeah, I should preface this by saying Happy Father's Day, Dad. I love you. You're the best. Nothing you do is ever wrong. But yeah. And I was very touched by the things that you said in your speech about the things that I have said, because I think it's it's a process. It's been like a process trying to square our views. It sounds really great in the speech, but it's taking a while.
I order. Okay.
No, I guess I wanted to, and I'm very aware that of the situation we're in here, just on this Zoom, and the fact that you, as a you talked about yourself as an older middle-aged white guy, you're the kind of Danny Finkelstein in a way, you're kind of telling everyone what you think, and maybe that we should think it as well. And I'm interested in basically the question I want to I think about all the time, because the people in this audience today, particularly people with maybe more kind of conservative views, are exactly the people who occupy my thoughts and my dreams about how we transform the Jewish community, and how we pursue justice as a community, and how we remove ourselves as a pillar of the occupation, which we are. Israel utilizes us to argue for the injustices that it practices on Palestinians. What my question is how do younger Jews make this case to older Jews? what are we doing? What are we doing?
We shut you down. We shut you down.
I mean, like, it's kind of, obviously there is an irony to me asking you as an older Jew, what should younger Jews do? Like, as if we need to be told. But like, I guess it's interesting to hear from you, and maybe even like from other people on the call who have like particular views about this, because this is what we want to know. How do we like bring you with us, like on this journey?
It's very simple. Don't use, okay, Rivka, it's very simple. Don't use the word apartheid because it doesn't apply.
Okay, that's
Okay.
an interesting one. Yeah,
It's the one thing that really annoys me. I'm actually much more radical than your dad from Israel, believe it or not.
yeah.
But I hate it when people say apartheid because it's not. And I'll tell you why. Because in my opinion, it's not true. And the reason it's not true is because apartheid in South Africa essentially was that everybody had group rights. You were a black, therefore you had a certain set of rights. You were white, therefore you had more rights. In Israel, what you have, let's say, not you have, everybody has a certain amount of rights, is individual rights. It's just that Jews have some group rights on top. That's not apartheid. It's something else. It's something that doesn't.
Okay, go on.
Something that doesn't exist anywhere else. I don't think there's a word.
That's really
I'm
interesting.
okay with apartheid.
Yeah. No. Anyway, I'm interested in hearing like a range of views and maybe.
Oh, you're breaking up, Rivka.
As you online.
Got a funny schism.
Rivka, your Wi-Fi's gone a bit wobbly.
How we should baptism.
Rivka, your Wi-Fi went a bit wobbly then.
Sorry, if I'm back, I just kind of maybe just wanted to like end with one more question. Okay, so we're done with it. I mean, unless you have any further reflections on the like, what should young Jews be doing question, that they're not. I have just one last question.
Young Jews could go to Israel and actually talk to Palestinians, talk to anybody there, and not just have these very easy platitudes sitting in London. I mean, I'm actually furious with this discussion. I think it's totally unfair. You've been flying all kinds of platitudes around, and we're not there. We're not on both sides. It's horrible on both sides. And so many people are just caught in the middle, wanting to be good with their neighbors from all different places, but you've got extremists on both sides, winding everybody up, making everybody very defensive and self-protective, and then attacking. And it's just, you're not helping by what you're doing, is what I think. And I'm surprised that you're doing this, actually. You're just dividing us up here in the UK as Jews and making us a very prey to people who are not Jewish, who are already very negative towards us.
Okay.
You're not helping us.
Okay.
That's why.
Okay, thanks.
We'll move along. Let's move along. Okay, point taken, Judith.
Yeah.
Annie.
Yeah.
No, hold on. We've got somebody else got their hand up.
Yeah, I think I agree with what's just been said. I mean, I'm quite cross as well. I'm an Alsace-Syrian Marxist, and I'm a South African, and it's not apartheid. And you know, these easy kind of, you know, we are progressive, and we understand why people are throwing bricks, and they're only just bricks, you know. You know, we've all got family in Israel. I've never been to Israel. I can't presume to know what goes on there. I don't presume to know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Fair enough. Any more questions? Michael.
It's me, Michael Goodman. You've given your exposition, but you've not given the cure.
Pardon?
You have given the diagnosis of what's happening there. You've had your wishful thinking as to the history wouldn't have. You wish history wouldn't have got this far, and you have, of course, you didn't ignore the Holocaust, but you didn't say what your solution is, apart from going and speaking nicely to some Palestinians. Now, it is a fundamental problem. It is a unique problem because we are probably the only living substantial group of people. The Armenians are in a similar situation, substantial group of people to have been wandering about for 2,000 years.
So, Michael, just can I just cut you short there, because you've got a question there. Do you want to get to the end of your question, please?
So, do you believe in a one-state solution or a two-state solution?
Okay.
And furthermore, I have my own criticisms, great criticisms of the Israelis, and it's what's happened in Israel since the Mapai ceased to be the government in the 70s, and when Begin came along, because the 67 war, the Israelis ended the 49 war with a bigger country than they expected in the partition. But they never rejected the partition. And to me, the partition, which was an accident of boundaries, was a rough and ready solution. Now, the Israelis had to occupy the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in order to prevent invasion, terrorism, what you will. And after the Six-Day War...
Can we keep it brief, please, Michael?
Yes, I'm saying, after the Six-Day War, there were no settlements apart from old kibbutzim. And it was then later on that there was a move to settle the West Bank. And my recollection is that the Israeli government of the day said, well, if we try and stop this, there'll be a civil war within Israel.
Okay, so I'm going to just stop you right there. You see, now you've given me quite a bit of historical exposition there. In a way, I think you're addressing Judith and Annie's point here, which is that the purpose of my talk this evening is not to give you a solution. The purpose of the talk this evening is my journey through Zionism. That's why you're here, to hear me give you my journey through Zionism. I have not been passive. I'm not giving easy platitudes. I have lived and worked in Israel. I have studied in Israel. I have just finished 6 months of working with Palestinians and Israelis remotely, making 7 documentary films with activists in Israel as an activist myself, which is going to go out to thousands of students across Britain in the next 6 months. Please don't accuse me of easy platitudes. I've been working closely with people who would very much like to get on the table. What I am saying is, and in response to Michael, all of your opinion, and Judith and Annie, I respect greatly, is that I don't presume on having a solution here. I don't know if it's going to be a one-state, two-state, or it's going to be perpetual war. I don't know. I wouldn't presume. I don't live there. But I am an activist, and I agree 100% with Rivka, is that the Israeli government uses us in the diaspora as a reason, as an excuse. That's my opinion. Okay, that's part of my journey through Zionism. If you were listening to me, you would have heard me say that I also cover off the history, and I do understand about the nastiness of the existence and the creation of the state of Israel. But I think the time has come now. The last provocation in Sheikh Jarrah for me was a watershed moment. It was a moment that broke the straw that broke the camel's back, which is, for all the stuff that's happened in the past, we are still just banging. We, Netanyahu, you, the government, are provoking the stone throwers. They get these people out of their homes in Sheikh Jarrah, which I told you in detail that I knew intimately. It's not somewhere that I have dreamed up about or fantasize about. This is somewhere I know intimately, okay? And I walked through with my Palestinian friends, who are like brothers to me. Okay, these are not fantasies of mine. That that removal of those people from those houses, which the Jews, the settlers, my fellow Jews had the title deeds. So we've got to get you out of here. No bullshit. You know, the Supreme Court in Israel is saying that's wrong, but it was enough to get these frightened people out of those streets in Sheikh Jarrah, to get the stone throwing idiots out on the street in East Jerusalem, because that's, as the guy that I read you from the New York Times, what else have we got to lose? You've got to listen to what we're saying here, not just bounce back at me your fixed thoughts. Get flexible here. Hang on, Annie, you can come back to me here in a sec. I'm nearly done. But the stone throwers came out. Netanyahu's happy. Hamas watching with their binoculars from Gaza say, great, the violence has started there. Let's get the bombs over. They threw a load over. They broke Iron Dome this time, nearly. Every single Iron Dome missile that goes up is $80,000. And there were thousands going up daily, you know, hundreds of Iron Dome. So we're talking about a lot of money going up in the air to stop this. And thank God for Iron Dome did exist. I'm not saying I wasn't glad we stopped it. Except it backfired. He thought it would get him re-elected, Mr. Strongman. It didn't. Annie, what were you gonna say? I'll shut up. I'll stop. I won't rant. Don't let me rant, Beth.
I wasn't going to say anything. I was just kind of nodding and shaking my head, but I will if you like. I wasn't saying that you presume. I was saying I don't presume, and I'm not saying that I agree with Netanyahu. Or, you know, I mean, obviously there's a lot that's wrong and a lot that needs putting right. But I just don't think that the Jews can kind of take it all on and say, you know, it's all our fault. And, you know, I just, sorry, I'm, you know, I think other people could probably put these things better than
thank you. Oh, Andrew, I don't want to degenerate into it's got to go forward and
yeah.
Andrew.
Yeah, two things. Thing one, I think anybody who's been to Israel any time in the last 10, 15, 20 years must be aware that Jews in Israel tend to live in a bubble where they mostly only speak to and meet other Jews. My son Alex, my daughter-in-law Shana, up to last autumn have been living in Haifa for 2 years, and Shana actually learnt both Hebrew and Arabic. She was working for a Palestinian women's civil rights organization, and she got out of that bubble. Both of them, I think, couldn't stay in Israel because of the injustices they perceived. That's just an observation. You tell people to go out and live in Israel. If you live in the bubble, you don't find anything out. If you don't live in the bubble and actually meet Palestinians, the experience that they had was that the injustices are things that you perceive. Thing two that I wanted to say is that here in the diaspora, you were quoting from the old prayer for the state of Israel. The new prayer for the state of Israel is much more, I suppose it's right wing. It includes a prayer for the IDF, which is referred to as protecting the state of Israel, which is no doubt true, but the assumption that the prayer makes, as opposed to the old prayer which talked about the land and all its inhabitants, they talk about basically the IDF, whatever the IDF does, is something that we are asking God to bless, and I don't think that's necessarily correct. And we certainly don't do anything to pray for Palestinian victims of terror. We only pray for the Israeli army. And here in the United Kingdom, when we're talking, Rivka was talking about, I suppose, our culpability in using that, and in supporting what the Israelis does. And I think the changes in the prayer that we have in the state of Israel are undoubtedly, they fit into the narrative that Rivka was actually telling us. The departure from the old prayer to the text of the new prayer, I think, is symptomatic of a right-wing move and extra polarization.
It's very interesting, Andrew. I think that's very interesting. I was quoting you from the old Singer's Prayer book that I grew up with my community, and actually it's got much more right-wing, that prayer, as the years have gone by. I would just, a couple of things in the chat. That I would just like to apologise if the Palestinian leadership don't want peace. Many Israelis do not agree with the settlers. This is from Marilyn. have you actually spoken to Israeli Arabs, many of whom would much rather live in Israel than under any of their fellow neighbours, or even the like that? The settlers are not nice people, but are by no means the only people in Israel. Sorry, Steve. No, you don't have to apologise. I'm with, you know.
I don't think Marilyn's on anymore.
And oh no, well, okay, well, I take that point. And Mark asked me about the project, the film project. I'll hopefully, well, I know, actually, I'll tell you in a nutshell, is that Rabbi David has invited Solutions Not Sides, for whom I made the films, to come to Muswell Hill in the autumn. And they're the people that I met them through Rabbi David originally, and they're coming back. So you'll get to hear much more about their film projects, hopefully, in the autumn. John Black, Jonathan, take your mute off.
Got it. Got to fiddle around with the buttons. So thank you, Stephen, for what for your monologue, as it were, and taking us through your own journey. And I hope that it's published wider somewhere, either in written form or I know this is going out on a link, but it's useful for others to hear. What I would like to do, just two things, is actually plug Ciarán, who you mentioned. I partook on a study tour that they run every year. They couldn't do it last year. I don't know whether they're doing it this year, but they take us over for a 5-day tour of the conflict in Jerusalem, taking us through Hebron and also to various places within the various settlements as well, or to a settlement as well. So seeing two parts of the problem, a tour through with Break Silence, and also meeting young activists and young politicians, as well as finishing off with a visit to the British Embassy. And I would really urge anyone who wants to get involved and look for solutions and discuss solutions and see both parts of the argument and actually see the horrors that are taking place over there, to get involved in and to sign up for that trip. The final point,
Jonathan,
I'd just like to
say what the solutions are that they recommend. You mentioned solutions.
Well, it's an ongoing discussion, isn't it? The solutions. I don't, I mean, the solutions are, they're an anti-occupation movement, an anti-occupation organisation. The solution is to, their solution is to end the occupation of the territories initially, the occupied territory, the West Bank initially, and then move from there. I mean, there's, I'm not going to say in a singular contribution what the solution is, but one of the solutions is, the main solution is to address the occupation and the further rebuilding of settlements around the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And they take you on that tour, engage and discuss, I think is really what I would say, rather than say what the solution is. The only other thing I would ask is, and this is a question to Rivka. Rivka, I follow you on Twitter. I enjoy your tweets. I do agree with some, don't agree with all of them. What I would like to know is, you made reference about a year ago to the bloke who sits next to your dad in shul, who accuses him of being a shouty lefty. Who are you referring to there?
Don't tell him, Rivka. Don't tell him. Who could that be?
No comment. I don't even actually remember.
Is that Ellis? Ellis is saying that he doesn't call you a shouty lefty.
No, I just talked about
he wouldn't dare.
My dad called me a shouty lefty.
I'm shouty. Anyway, he's shouty.
He talks about cars. He's saying, while I'm on, I just thought I might sort of like share a recollection, because you reminded me, Stephen, that when I was doing my art foundation course at Rochdale College of Art, having had a gap year in Israel on a kibbutz, my best friend became a Palestinian girl from East Jerusalem, whose father had a hotel there. And I remember that I invited her over for the weekend, and she had to get permission from her parents to spend the weekend with a Jewish family. But she was telling us even then, so this would have been in 1980, I guess, that she always had to have her identity card on her, and she felt quite threatened when she was walking around her sort of like her home. And I just remember thinking to myself, that feels very uncomfortable. I mean, what on earth would a sort of 17, 18-year-old girl, you know, why would she need to sort of like, you know, be searched or show her identity? And it just kind of resonated with me, really. And I think that lots of my friends who live in Israel are sort of more left-leaning, and they will, you know, some of them live in mixed communities which have had varying degrees of success, more with Arab Israelis, not with Palestinians. But I know that, you know, whenever I go to visit, they always say, right, we're going to the local Arab village, we're going to go to their restaurants. You know, they always go out of their way to, you know, engage with their neighbours. And, you know, I do think that there is a way to make peace. I'm an optimist like you. And I just think that, you know, I sort of like have in my mind that Gaza could be a holiday resort. And I just think that if the people of Gaza were prosperous and the West Bank, I think Hamas wouldn't even get a look in. I just think that, you know, I just think, why can't everybody live together and be prosperous? That is what I would like to see. Whether it happens in my lifetime, I can't say. But that's what I would like.
See, I think that's a good answer to the idea of what is the solution. The solution is to start a process, as both Jonathan and Ciarán have highlighted. It's a starting a process. It's an opening of doors. I mean, as a psychotherapist now, as well as a filmmaker, you don't sort of get to say, right, I'm going to cure you. I'm going to give you the solution straight away. You work through something. We haven't even started the process of working through. We need to get back in that position. And there are people, both Palestinians and Israelis, that were ready to do this, or would be, but I think, from my experience of knowing, and I think perhaps that's what Ciarán and Jonathan are saying, and there are programs here that we can get involved with and participate in that will educate us and get us starting that dialogue as well. Because I don't think the diaspora is irrelevant and that we don't have a right to speak about Israel. I've never thought that. How are we doing, Beth?
Has anybody else got any questions? Otherwise, I think if you all want to take yourselves off mute and give Stephen a nice round of applause, Muswell Hill style. And say thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks.
We're going to put the recording on the website. I'm sure. Yeah.
Yes, it will.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
The recording started and it stopped and it started and it stopped.
It did stop and start.
There's only a couple of words missing.
Okay.